We saw a figure wrapped in vines, but the vines were moving on their own. At first we thought it was the wind. The forest around us was dense enough that wind rarely reached the ground. The canopy sealed the sky into green-black layers, and what little light slipped through looked strained and watery, as though it had filtered through deep water. Still, something in the branches above stirred occasionally, and the long curtains of ivy that hung from the trees would sway like breath moving through a sleeping chest. So when the vines around the figure shifted, tightening and loosening slowly, we assumed a breeze had found its way down. But the leaves around us were perfectly still. The air itself felt thick, humid and strangely warm despite the late hour. Every step we took pressed the smell of wet soil upward, a dark loamy scent mixed with crushed ferns and the faint rot of fallen wood. It clung to the back of the throat. Marcus stopped walking first. "Do you see that?" he whispered. The beam of his flashlight trembled across the trees and landed on the shape ahead of us. It stood perhaps 30 feet away between two massive oaks whose trunks twisted together near their bases like knotted rope. At first the figure looked like nothing more than a stump or a broken limb leaning upright. Then the vines shifted again. They were wrapped around the shape in dozens of layers. Thick forest creepers, dark green and braided like muscle fibers. Their leaves shivered slightly, not with wind but with a slow internal movement. Tendrils slid across one another with a faint rasping sound, like dry fingers brushing fabric. I felt the temperature drop a few degrees. "You think someone tied those up there?" I said quietly. Marcus didn't answer. The vines slid again. Not randomly, purposefully. They tightened around the figure's shoulders and torso, then loosened, the way a hand tests the firmness of a grip. The flashlight beam flickered over something pale beneath them. Skin, or what looked like skin. "Hello," Marcus called out. The word vanished into the forest almost immediately. No echo, just the soft background noise of insects and the distant clicking of tree frogs. The vines stilled. Then one of them lifted, not lifted by wind or by the sagging pull of gravity, but raised, slow and deliberate, like an arm. The thin tendril extended outward toward us, the tip curling slightly in the air. Marcus stepped back. "Okay," he muttered, voice thin. "That's not right." The tendril lowered again and wrapped itself around the figure's neck. For a moment we stood frozen. Then I noticed something worse. The figure itself was moving, not struggling, breathing, a shallow rise beneath the vines, a faint expansion under the leaf-covered chest. The vines responded immediately. They tightened. The movement beneath them slowed. Then the vines loosened again, as though regulating it. "Someone's in there," I said. Marcus shook his head slowly. "I don't think they're in there anymore." He moved the flashlight slightly higher. The beam caught the face, or what had once been a face. The vines had grown across it in thin strands that crossed the cheeks and jaw like a net. Moss filled the hollows around the eyes. Small leaves sprouted along the temples. But beneath the growth there was still a mouth, slightly open, dark inside. Something in the vines shifted again. A ripple passed through them, starting near the feet of the figure and traveling upward along the torso like a slow pulse. Then another ripple followed. The sound came a moment later. Faint wet creaking. Not from the person. From the plants. Marcus took another step back. "You hear that?" I did. The vines were rubbing against one another with quiet, deliberate friction. Their movement was subtle, almost delicate, but there were too many of them. Dozens, maybe hundreds, and they were all moving. The forest around us seemed to lean inward. I suddenly became aware of the vines hanging from the nearby trees, the ivy crawling up the trunks, the tangled roots beneath the soil, all of it, connected. The figure's head tilted slightly, not by its own muscles, by the vines. They tightened along one side of the neck and rotated the head slowly until the face pointed directly at us. The moss in the eye sockets trembled. Marcus whispered something under his breath. "What?" I asked. "I've seen this before." His voice sounded wrong, strained and hollow. "Where?" He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he moved the flashlight downward. The vines covering the figure's arms were thinner there, revealing patches of skin beneath. The skin had a gray-green tint, as though chlorophyll had seeped into it. Tiny root-like filaments threaded through the pores. Marcus inhaled sharply. "It's him," he said. "Who?" "Daniel." The name landed in the air between us like something fragile. Daniel had disappeared 3 months earlier. Same trail, same forest. The search teams had combed the area for days before giving up. Marcus took a slow step forward. The vines tightened instantly, not just around Daniel's body, around the surrounding trees. The ivy climbing the trunks shivered. A low rustling spread outward through the undergrowth like a whisper being passed from plant to plant. "Marcus," I said quietly. He didn't stop. "Daniel?" he called softly. The vines around the figure's throat twitched. The mouth opened a little wider. Something moved inside. Not a tongue. A root. Thin and pale, sliding slowly forward from the darkness of the throat. Marcus stopped walking. The root extended outward, tasting the air. Then it withdrew again. The vines shifted in agitation. They began sliding across Daniel's skin with greater urgency now, tightening around his arms and chest in slow spirals. Leaves brushed together with soft clicking sounds. The forest had grown quieter. The frogs had stopped. The insects had faded. Even the wind in the canopy had disappeared. Marcus backed up until he stood beside me again. "Did you see?" "I saw." The vines lifted again. Several of them. They stretched outward toward us like reaching fingers. The tips swayed slowly in the humid air. I could hear them now. Not just the rustling. Something deeper. A faint rhythmic vibration traveling through the vines themselves. Like a murmur. Or speech. Marcus turned his flashlight away from the figure and swept it across the surrounding trees. The beam revealed something that made my stomach tighten. The trunks around us were covered in vines. More than before. Long ropes of them spiraled down from the canopy and stretched across the forest floor. And they were moving. Not violently, just enough. Sliding slowly across bark. Curling around roots. Turning toward us. The figure between the oaks jerked slightly. The vines tightened around Daniel's jaw. His mouth opened wider. The sound that came out was dry and brittle. Not quite a voice. Not quite wind. More like the sound of branches bending under snow. Marcus grabbed my arm. "We need to go." The vines nearest our feet twitched. One of them slid across the soil and brushed against my boot. Felt warm. Alive. I stepped back instinctively. The tendril followed. Marcus pulled me farther down the trail. Behind us, the forest rustled louder. The movement spread outward through the trees in a widening wave. Leaves trembled. Creepers tightened around trunks. The undergrowth shifted as though something enormous beneath the soil had stirred. We didn't run at first. Running felt too loud, too noticeable. But the farther we moved, the more the sounds behind us grew. Branches creaking, vines sliding, 1,000 tiny movements threading together into one long crawling noise. Marcus finally broke into a sprint. I followed. The beam of his flashlight bounced wildly across the trail. Shadows of branches twisted across the ground like grasping hands. The air grew colder as we ran. Colder and damper. The smell of earth thickened until it almost tasted metallic. Behind us something cracked. A heavy branch snapping. Or perhaps something pulling free from the trees. Marcus risked a glance over his shoulder. His face went pale. "Don't look," he said. Which meant, of course, I did. The trail behind us was no longer empty. The vines had reached it. They spilled across the ground in thick green ropes, sliding over one another with patient determination. Some dragged leaves and roots behind them like trailing nerves. And between them, for a moment I thought I saw shapes. Human shapes. Wrapped. Standing. Watching. The forest seemed to inhale. We ran until the trees thinned and the pale glow of the parking lot appeared through the trunks. Only then did the sounds behind us begin to fade. Marcus slammed the car door shut and locked it immediately. Neither of us spoke for several minutes. The forest line stood dark and motionless beyond the headlights. Finally Marcus said quietly, "You saw his face." I nodded. "And the vines?" he continued, voice hollow. "They were keeping him." I didn't answer, because something was tapping softly against the windshield. A thin green tendril had reached the glass. It curled slowly against the surface, tracing the edge of the wiper blade. Then another vine slid up beside it. And another. Beyond the headlights, the forest was moving again. Very slowly, as though it had begun walking toward us. The wind carried a voice telling us we were already lost. It slipped between the trees with the dry hush of moving leaves, quiet enough that at first I thought I'd imagined it. We had been walking for hours, our boots sinking into soft needles and damp soil, and the forest had that heavy afternoon stillness that blurs the edges of sound. Marcus stopped ahead of me. "You hear that?" he asked. The wind moved again. Not strong, just a narrow stream of air threading through the trunks, stirring the high branches. The canopy whispered in long, sliding breaths. And beneath that whisper, "You are already lost." The voice wasn't loud. It didn't echo. It felt as though it had spoken from somewhere inside the wind itself. Every word stretched thin across the rustling leaves. I laughed nervously. "That's just the trees," I said. Marcus didn't move. He was staring into the forest like he was trying to see through it. "Trees don't say things like that." The trail behind us had already faded into the undergrowth. This part of the forest was older than the park map suggested. Dense cedar and hemlock packed close together, their trunks straight and tall like pillars holding up a dim green ceiling. Light came down in thin, slanted ribbons that shifted slowly as the branches above drifted. Even standing still, I felt like the forest was moving around us. "We're not lost," I said. "The trail loops back toward the ridge." Marcus checked the compass clipped to his pack. The needle drifted, not spinning, just sliding slightly off-center, then easing back. "Maybe," he said. The wind passed again. It was colder this time. It slipped across the back of my neck and down inside my collar like a searching hand. "Already lost." The words seemed softer now, stretched longer, as though the forest itself had spoken through 1,000 tiny mouths. Marcus turned slowly in a circle. "You hear how it's following us?" I hadn't noticed until he said it. The wind didn't come from a direction. It moved between the trees in small shifting currents that always seemed to brush past our ears no matter which way we faced. I forced a shrug. Wind does that. But the temperature kept dropping. The air around us had grown oddly layered, pockets of warmth sitting beside cold drifting streams. When the wind passed, it pulled the warmth away and left the cold behind like something deliberate. We started walking again. The forest floor rose gently uphill, scattered with fallen branches and old moss-covered logs. Every step released the smell of wet bark and decaying leaves. Somewhere far off a crow gave a single hoarse call. Then silence. The wind returned. "You walked too far." Marcus stopped again. "That's not wind," he said. The voice had changed. It still rode the air, but now the words were clearer, woven into the shifting leaves with strange precision. The tone wasn't threatening. If anything, it sounded patient, ancient, like someone explaining something obvious to a child. "You walked too far," the wind murmured again. Marcus swallowed. "Who's there?" The forest didn't answer, but the air moved gently through the branches, stirring a ring of trees around us. Leaves trembled. The sunlight filtering through them flickered oddly, bending and straightening in slow pulses like light moving through water. "We should turn back," I said. Marcus checked the compass again. The needle now pointed somewhere between north and the ground. "That's not possible. Then the compass is broken." "Both of them." He held up his phone. The digital compass icon spun lazily in a slow circle. The wind brushed past my ear. "You turned already." My stomach tightened. "What does that mean?" I whispered. Marcus stared down the slope behind us. The path we had climbed up, if it had been a path at all, was gone. The trees stood closer together now. The underbrush looked undisturbed, smooth and unbroken. No footprints, no broken twigs. Just moss and leaves like no one had ever stepped there. The wind moved again. It slid between the trunks with a sound like breath through teeth. You crossed. Marcus's voice dropped. Crossed what? The forest creaked. Somewhere above us a branch shifted with a deep wooden groan. I noticed then how the light had changed. The sun was still somewhere overhead, but its rays came down in narrow warped columns that leaned slightly to one side. Dust and pollen drifted through them like suspended ash. The air itself looked bent. The wind whispered again. You didn't notice. Marcus grabbed my arm. Look at the trees. At first they seemed normal. Then I saw it. Every trunk around us leaned inward by the smallest amount. Not toward the center of the forest. Toward us, like a circle slowly closing. Trees grow like that sometimes, I said, though my voice sounded thin even to me. Marcus didn't answer. He was watching the canopy. The wind passed through the branches in slow waves now, moving from tree to tree with unnatural rhythm. Each gust carried a faint tone, almost musical, almost like speech broken into pieces. Lost. The words stretched across the rustling leaves. Lost. The air grew colder again. The smell of the forest thickened, sap, damp wood, crushed ferns. Beneath it lurked another scent, faint but unmistakable. Old stone, like the smell of a cave. Marcus started walking faster. Doesn't matter what it is, he muttered. We just keep moving east. How do you know that's east? He didn't answer. The forest changed gradually as we walked. The ground sloped downward, then upward again, though we hadn't turned. The trees grew denser, their trunks crowding closer until the light between them narrowed into long shadowed corridors. The wind followed us, always just behind, always whispering. Sometimes it spoke in full words. Sometimes only fragments slipped through the leaves. Too late, too far. Already, Marcus began answering it. At first he just muttered under his breath. Then louder. We're not lost, he said sharply. The wind brushed past us. You stopped knowing where you were. The words felt different this time. Not just heard. Felt like someone had reached into my thoughts and turned them over slowly. I suddenly realized I couldn't remember the trailhead. Not clearly. The parking lot was there somewhere in my memory, but its shape blurred when I tried to picture it. The road leading out of the forest felt distant and uncertain. Marcus stopped walking. His shoulders had tightened. What did the sign say? He asked. What sign? At the start of the trail. I opened my mouth. Nothing came out. The wind moved softly through the branches. You left it behind. Marcus's breathing grew faster. That's not possible, he whispered. The trees around us creaked again. The sound traveled outward like a ripple in wood. I turned slowly. The forest behind us looked deeper, darker. The spaces between the trunks seemed longer than before. Marcus grabbed my sleeve. Do you hear it? At first I heard nothing. Then the wind rose. Not stronger, just fuller, as though more air had begun moving through the forest all at once. The whispers layered over one another. Dozens of faint voices woven into the rustling canopy. Lost, lost, lost. Marcus covered his ears. It's inside my head. The wind slid past my cheek. And this time the voice spoke very clearly. Right beside my ear. You were lost before you arrived. I turned. No one stood there. Just the trees swaying slowly under a sky that no longer seemed to exist. Marcus pointed suddenly. Look! The ground ahead dipped into a narrow valley where the trees thinned slightly. At the bottom stood a wooden sign. Old, weathered. We walked toward it carefully. The wind fell quiet. The sign leaned crookedly between two stones. Its paint had peeled almost completely away, but I could still make out the faint carved letters beneath. Marcus read them aloud. Trail entrance. His voice cracked. We walked past this hours ago. The wind returned. Soft, patient. The branches above us shifted. And the voice drifted down once more through the leaves. Yes. Marcus slowly turned toward the forest behind us. The trees had closed together again. The path we'd just walked down was gone. Only dark trunks and endless green shadow. The wind moved gently around our shoulders like guiding hands. And somewhere deep in the forest, far beyond sight, something vast exhaled, as though it had been waiting for us to understand.